Melissa and I are authors, urban mobility advocates, social media influencers, I hate that word, and professionals working, living in the Netherlands, specifically in Delft. Myself working for an organization called the Dutch Cycling Embassy, and Melissa for Mobicon.
What are the important ingredients you have seen in cities that are making good changes for cyclists?
Coming from Vancouver, even a lot of it starts with the political leadership that usually comes from strong advocacy or people leading local municipal teams. It's hard to get those changes to happen. So I think that's the first big ingredient.
Melissa and I spend a lot of time talking about networks and the importance of network-based thinking. We've built networks for cars for decades. We seldom talk about cycling networks in our day-to-day lives. We're so focused on individual lanes and complete streets that we miss the bigger picture. This idea of the city as a series of origins and destinations, and making sure that we're building a minimum grid of cycle routes, not just one, two, but dozens and dozens of them. Once we get those cycling networks on the ground, we've seen examples in Vancouver, Calgary, Montreal, other North American cities. That's when you see the ridership really grow, the diversity of people really explode. But getting to that point is really the hardest part of the equation.
How do you win over the car-centric residents into believing that cycling is a viable transportation option?
Well, I think first it's about busting the myth that most seemingly car-centric people aren't a little bit interested in what cycling can offer. I think back to earlier days in Vancouver and forcing some of my friends to come on cycle rides with me who lived in the suburbs and drove into the city every day and were likely never to change that pattern because it's what made the most sense for them. It was the most convenient. But experiencing the city a little bit differently, it wasn't going to change their habits on a permanent basis, but it did make them think, oh yeah, that's why you want to put a bike lane there, because this is super uncomfortable to cycle next to you.
It's not black, white, bikes versus cars. It's this beautiful nuanced gray area where we can start framing this as a win-win situation. And I think that's always our key message. Is it's not taking space away from cars to benefit and advantage bicycles. It's replacing these short, unnecessary car journeys in our neighborhood with more space-efficient modes, freeing up precious road space for people who still want to drive. And so Downtown Vancouver Business Association came out against bike lanes at the beginning and did a complete 180 10 years later and started supporting bike lanes. It does take time. That controversy is inevitable. It's part of the growing pains, but you do need a political leader that will see it out and not step back from the edge or water down their proposals or give up partway through because the going got tough. And that's, I think, your role as advocates.
How would you convince the city to go in on a trial grid like what was done in Calgary?
We've got, I think, enough examples of not just in Europe now, but in North America that show that the true gains to ridership, to reduced congestion, to improve safety and livability only happen at the network level, that you get this amplifying exponential effect once you connect these routes in a minimum grid, as you referred to. So yeah, if they can do it in Oil Town in the Canadian prairies and induce, 1.8 million cycle trips over the 18-month period just by reallocating 2% of the road space. I mean, and Seville in Spain did a similar experiment where they dropped a minimum grid on their streets and the cycling numbers went up 30 or 40% overnight. Calgary came along after watching Vancouver struggle for 10 years and said, oh, we're going to do it in
2 years.
2 years. And so I think there's a lot to be said about moving quickly, but it has to be done in an intelligent way, a strategic way, and a holistic way.
And if you look to a city like Berlin that put in a bunch of temporary pop-up networks to help people get to work during the pandemic who were not going to be using public transportation. You saw it in Italy as well. Paris sort of building temporary that has become permanent quite quickly. But these are all fairly low-cost ways of making those connections in the gaps to at least trial it. And that's where Calgary, is the perfect example, because they trial it and then they adjust it if it's not working. And having that temporary sort of demonstration shows that it's worthwhile, but also that if it's not permanent, it can be adjusted.
To come back to the original question, how you convince people to make it happen, I think the answer is really different for every single city. What is the larger theme and the discussion happening in London where cycling is the answer? Is London aiming to be more equitable, more sustainable, more affordable? Again, cycling is the policy tool to help make that happen, but it's really up to you. What are the broader themes that you want to tie into those aspirations of what London wants to be at 10, 20, 50 years from now, and how potentially more people cycling can help make that happen?
Okay, so what are things that make you hopeful about positive changes in North American cities?
If we weren't optimistic, if we weren't convinced that this is possible, then we wouldn't get up in the morning. we wouldn't do the jobs that we do. And I think that's one of the amazing privileges of working for the organizations that we do, is that every day we sit down with likely cities like your Vancouvers and your Seattles and your New Yorks, but unlikely places like Austin, Texas, and Sarnia, Ontario, and some other unlikely candidates. And in every city, again, this change is sparked by a champion who have a better vision for their community and want to create change. So, I mean, I talk endlessly about Austin because the Dutch Cycling Embassy's worked there for 10 years. And in this kind of sprawling Sunbelt Southern American city, we've managed to help them build over 350 kilometers of red-tinted, Dutch-inspired cycleways. And if you can do it in the heart of Texas, you can do it anywhere. It just, again, comes down to those ingredients. They don't have any other special sauce, but they've set a standard of the cycling infrastructure they want to build and a goal to make themselves more affordable, livable, equitable, and sustainable. And yeah, they've really kind of quietly under the radar created this template of importing best practice from the Netherlands into a pretty car-dominated environment. So it's examples like that keep us going. And if it is possible in a place like Austin, then why not anywhere else?
I think for a more local context for me, I think, seeing the work coming out of Waterloo, even if it is piecemeal, there seems to be proactivity there that when we were growing up there in the 90s would be unimaginable. And also having lived in Guelph before we moved out west, these little pockets of what would be considered suburbia, which a lot of people may consider London as well, making these investments and showing this, like, maybe not determined or really expansive commitment, but understanding this as part of the conversation, even in very conservative places. And I think that's going forward, the positive that I see is that places, like Chris said, these unlikely suspects that are recognizing that just car-dominated space is not sustainable.
Are there any other pieces of advice that you'd like to give to the cycling advocates here in London?
I would just reiterate, find the themes, the topics that work for your city, and talk about how mobility can address those. It's not about the bike, it's not about the car, it's not about the tram, train, or bus. It's about livability and making everyone's lives better, whether they get on a bike or not. And
the only thing I would add to that, and I think it's something that we all forget, whether we're working or, working in advocacy spaces, is, we came here because of a joy, and we shouldn't forget that. And so if we're feeling overwhelmed, or if we've, like I said before, if you need to tag out, just don't forget the joy that brought you to this space. I think, we can all say that getting on a bike for a lot of us is just a moment of catharsis. It calms us down. We feel happy. We all have memories of certain experiences that are ingrained in us as to why it is that we love to cycle. But remembering that joy is part of staying sane in this space and keeping that drive.
Okay, let me get on my soapbox for a minute. Just stop engaging with the bad faith arguments. I think that's one thing that we learn very quickly as advocates is there's people you're never going to convince and aren't interested in actually having a good faith discussion or debate. But if you can articulate a positive, inclusive vision for your city and how transportation and mobility helps accomplish that, then I think you might attract more bees with honey, so to speak, when you think and talk big picture and don't get stuck in the trenches.
So what is the mindset we should strive for as advocates to help us succeed and persist? Because sometimes it's a lot.
It's, again, what I said earlier, is understanding that all of this change is slow. And, when we look at bike lanes and the opponents to it see only one person using it, it's deemed a failure. But it was actually, we need to look at that, flip it and look at it as a win. Like, that one person was not there before. And so understanding that even if that change is incremental, even if what we're doing and the fights we keep having and the conversations we have to repeat over and over and over again are only making these small changes, you are actually improving the quality of life for one person, for a handful of individuals. And that has a domino effect that over time will benefit everybody.